The Rundown, Part 24, a Farlost story by John Miro.
Twilight fell upon the darkening road. I found myself again alone. Street lights went out by one, by two, by three. Now reveled in the shadows that had grown. Yes, I reveled in the darkness I had known.
At the very center of Locklaw Sky City, surrounded by the Cathedra, the former dragon capital and now a preserved hated ruin, the Harbinger Forest, the T Valley, the mass grave known as the Haunts, and the city defense bunker complex, lay the Manor Highlands. The Highlands are a region of mountain ranges, lakes, and grassy plains. In the days of the dragons, it was pristine wilderness, or as close as you can get on a chunk of world floating in the sky. These highlands were reserved as a place for the elite to enjoy as their ancestors had, before the climb from bestiality up to feudalism on the road to civilization and technology that would take them to Farlost. Since the end of their reign, Locklaw's new management kept the area pristine, declaring the highlands off-limits to building, mining, and expansion. Even flyovers are strictly limited. It remains, for the most part, a place of breathtaking mountains, dark, cold lakes, and natural ranges with awe-inspiring views clear to the city wall some days. Creeping in under the wire and giving these formerly sparse highlands their name, a few dozen of the most powerful sentients to participate in the rebellion and civil war constructed sprawling mansions there. Arguments still rage in council sessions and city newscasts about these manors, but they exist, like many unfair things. Completely coincidentally, or so the population is assured, most councillors claim a manor of their own, despite decades of councillors being elected and removed from office. On the border of the highlands, between the ruins of the Dragon Cathedra and the sprawling underground city defense complex, lay a single government building above ground. The council hall is a majestic building just 3 stories tall, made entirely of glass and transparent alloys. By tradition, the electric charge frosting all the rooms and chambers within the hall is disabled when council is in session, a gesture towards the right of all Locklaw's citizens to know what occurs in their government. During session, all citizens are free to collect on the fields and watch how their elected officials vote on important issues and listen to them speak and present new laws for the council's consideration. A face, a palm, a leg segment, a tentacle, or a tail filled every inch of window as their elected councillors climbed the stairs at the center of the room and took their places. Following immediately behind them came a limping system guard consul Gomersall. The foreigner was present as the official representative of Haven SG, appointed by emergency proxy after the murder of General Lehman Tarquis. Gomersall smiled as the shouts and hisses rained upon him, waving and smiling broadly as he took his honored seat at one of the guest benches between the circle of councillors' benches and the raised speaker's podium at its center above the stairs. The riot of sound had been expected, however, and for the first time in history of Locklaw Council, those clear windows were sealed, and sound was transmitted via speaker. By prior agreement of all 17 currently sitting councillors, the crowd's roar was dialed down to a manageable level, though not muted completely. That wouldn't have been democratic. Last to climb the stairs and take their seats were councillors Cree and Underwood. The crowd's volume grew louder at the sight of the 2 fierce opponents bowing to each other before taking their places. Cree sat at his usual bench, while Underwood, as the sponsor of these trade negotiations, wove his way between the councillors' benches, nodded respectfully at Gomersall, and climbed the speaker's podium to open the session. Councillor Underwood hefted a perfectly smooth, perfectly spherical stone, almost the size of his hand, rippled with onyx and white, and let it fall 3 times against the rough-hewn square of mantle mounted on the podium. Both the gavel and block had been carved from the depths of Locklaw itself. Every voice fell silent before the echo of the 3rd booming strike of the gavel fell away. surprising the councilors and the unruly mob itself. "Thank you," Underwood said in the heavy silence. "We few who carry the weight of law entrusted to us by the many have come together today outside of normal duties and ceremony. We are here to cast our votes and decide if Locklaw will end its embargo of Haven SG and, furthermore, establish trade with our sister Sky City. Councilor Underwood." Eyes narrowed, but face carved in a solemn mask, Underwood held out his hand and the stone gavel in it towards the speaker. "We recognize Councilor Cree, who wishes to speak against this vote." Cree swam up into the air, expanding his air sacs to their fullest. The manta beat his wings powerfully and soared into the air, turning to catch each councilor's gaze in turn. "Brothers and sisters, today is the final day to decide who we are. You have heard me ask the hard questions over and over. You have heard me share the people's fear that we are letting the system guard in through the front door instead of forcing them to show their hand in conquest, if that is indeed their mission here in Locklaw." The silence held. None of this was new. The councilors waited, faces unmoved by the words and the opinion of the Manta councilor, faces that were stiff with suspicion. "I have been accused of orchestrating a terrorist event to stop these negotiations," he cried out, facing the cause for those suspicious gazes head on. "This is not so. Yes, I have voiced my grave fears about the system guard since the day my fellow Councilor Underwood first suggested them." A pause, a dramatic beat of wings, and then Cree drew a gasp from the assembly when he dived straight for Council Gomersall. The consul didn't react, other than to smile and nod respectfully. In the center of the hall, Underwood's brow furrowed. "I did call Haven to a private meeting, yes, to allay my fears, to hear the consul out, to learn more after his impassioned speech on the steps of Peertown Hospital, and his words, and the words of a common soldier whose brother perished for a terrorist's mindless hate of the system guard, the very same hate that has shed blood now on our streets, Locklaw's streets." The silence was as heavy as the gavel stone in Underwood's hands, as Cree placed a tail on Gomersall's shoulder. "This morning, I accepted Consul Gomersall's grateful thanks that a son of Locklaw, Police Captain Addison Yates, gave his all, his very life, to save his life. And I had heard enough." Every eye in the hall or crushed against the window outside was locked on Cree and Gomersall, who stood beside Cree now. For his part, Cree turned his gaze upwards toward the speaker's bench. "I think Councilor Underwood said it best when he said it is only through reconciliation and forgiveness that we can rebuild and expand our fortunes." A gasp spread like a tidal wave throughout the hall. The crowd outside drew in one collective great breath of shock. Councilor Underwood's face betrayed his own complete surprise. "I finally had that meeting with Consul Gomersall in another Locklaw hospital, and it was there that he accepted my tearful, heartfelt apology for my words, my actions, and for the unspeakable atrocity that befell his comrades on the streets of a city I believed knew better." The consul cleared his throat. "I speak for the System Guard and for Haven SG when I say how moved I was by Councilor Cree's willingness to move past his own prejudices and create a better tomorrow for us all. Should this council approve this plan, I will be pleased to accept Councilor Cree's offer to represent our interests here in Locklaw and trust his guarantee that our people will enjoy his protection within these city walls." Amidst the complete silence of the council hall and the speechless mobs gathered beyond, came the crash of the gavel stone falling from the speaker's hand. Its weight careened across the floor, echoing across the chamber like ominous, distant thunder. Cripes, where are you, boss? Spillane's muted voice barely escaped the folds of Ada's robes. He cracked his host body's eyes, incomplete awareness flooding back to him. He was lying down, but not in his bed. Not Jane's either. A guest room. He spied the silk robe he'd taken to wearing after joining with Jane. It lay in a pile beside the bed. Spillane's voice was letting loose a long string of profanity from within it. Jane, what the hell did you... The bed shifted beneath him, from someone else's movement. He swung himself out of bed, swaying on his feet as he turned his naked body to see another form. Human. Male. Well, he thought to himself, that explains the other aches. He collected the robe and shrugged it on, swallowing an angry growl at this drastic breaking of the trust he and Jane had been fostering together. He turned his back on the man and left the room. He strode angrily to the other side of the 4th floor where he kept his private rooms. Keyed to his biometrics alone, they slid open as he approached, revealing a library/sitting room. Only after they had closed and locked behind him did he pull the slate from his pocket and scan the list of messages. Ada was fuming. Joining with anyone always had its bumps, but Jane had always been fastidious and polite about returning their body to him in ways and places they'd agreed on in advance. He struggled against how easy the joining had been this time to remember this was bound to have happened. He ignored the messages from Spillane, instead tagging the single message from Jane with 2 fingers and throwing it into the air. Sensors throughout the room cataloged the gesture, and a holofield coalesced in the air, revealing a naked, disheveled Jane sitting on the corner of the very same bed he'd just left, with the very same unconscious man laid out equally naked behind her. "Ada," she sobbed once, and struggled for breath. And all Ada's fury evaporated, seeing her hurting, seeing her lost. He listened, and he understood, and he hurt too. Oh, Jane. Past the pain, Jane's words turned from the past to the present and added to Ada's own recent revelations. He listened again. He listened twice more. Then, with a mix of adrenaline and foreboding singing up and down his spine, he finally called for Spillane. Nick rubbed the back of his head, looking blearily around. The Skanen in the leather jacket kicked the side of his bed again to fully wake him, and then pulled him out of the guest room with barely enough time to throw on his shirt and pants. He worked for him, her, them. Nick was still wrapping his head around all of it. He'd grown up knowing the parent of a friend who'd been joined. He'd come up through the police academy with a hide too, but they weren't all that common. Approaching the legendary fixer and peacekeeper that ran the roadhouse, and finding out he now resided inside your ex-partner, that was a bit of a surprise. Spillane pointed to a hall on the right, and Nick went where he was guided. He rubbed his jaw, grinning for a moment at his explosive reunion with Jane. She was still fiery, still indomitable. He'd been shocked and overjoyed to see her alive, out of prison, not dead. The smile faded, though, as he recalled how furiously she had lashed out at him. Nick remembered staring at the place Roland Bird's face had been, completely forgetting where he was, until Jane had started her attack again. He couldn't fight back, and she had pummeled him hard before Tyson pulled her off. It wasn't just the shock of seeing her, or the fact that she was his ex-partner that kept him from resisting her. She was also much stronger and faster now. Even handle the superhuman strength, faster cognitive processing, and enhanced recuperation and metabolism. But what had left him sitting on his ass, watching Jane tear into Tyson, robbed of his strength and ability to think about the danger that had brought him here, was the ferocity of her attack. She had stood her ground against Tyson, too. The last spark of willpower Nick had felt had been to warn Tyson not to hurt her, that she was sick and angry and had every reason to be. Before he could make a sound, Tyson was on the ground, rolling end over end to impact the side of that beautiful long wooden bar. And when Tyson got up, with something like a grin on his face, Usher just sat on his ass, watching his former partner lay blow after hammering blow on Tyson. Soon after, Jane closed again on Tyson, shrieking, whirling, and growing increasingly more violent and mindless in her attack. Tyson abandoned his defensive stance to get in shots of his own. Barely aware of the Skanen bouncers quickly clearing the room, Nick had watched as Jane's attack began to falter. Minutes went by. Jane's body flew, Tyson's body flew. She shouldn't have been able to keep her feet under her, but somehow she kept swinging and kicking. Tyson, face beaded with sweat, matched every blow, blood dripping from one corner of a savage grin. Then, in a moment, Tyson pinned one of her arms beneath his own. Rearing his head back in expectation of a counterattack, maybe a headbutt, a face bite, something, he instead froze as the vicious fighter in his arms broke into tears. Moments later, the bigger man held the frail woman close as she sobbed. He turned his gaze to look at Usher. All concern for the man vanished. In its place was an accusatory glare. "What did you do to her?" his face asked. Drawing him out of his thoughts, Spillane's claws grabbed the back of Usher's shirt, tugging him to a stop at the end of a hall, keeping him a meter away from a pair of massive, ornate wooden doors. "Wait here," he grumbled, turned, and stomped back down the hall the way he'd come. Usher waited, his mind again drifting to Roland Bird's giant face sneering from the windows of the roadhouse. His hand drifted toward the cylinder hanging from his neck. Ada wasn't a judge. She wasn't a counselor. The Hyde was a fixer. He was endangering his career coming here like this. An image of Pesh's insides, sprayed over the inside of Willer's cockpit, replaced Bird's sneering face, and he knew coming to the roadhouse had been the right call. Even before he'd found out who else lived here now. "Come," came a soft voice. Jane's voice. The doors opened. And the doors closed behind him, and Nick was alone in a room filled with books and giant-sized sofas, and Jane. She turned from the window along the wall to Usher's left and paced back his way, taking a gulp from a large white mug she held in both hands. He winced when he saw the bruise darkening beneath her left eye. Next, he took in the shaven scalp on that side of her head. Then Nick saw the circular tattoos on her neck, and he stepped forward, questions stumbling over each other in his brain. Jane held out a hand, and Nick held his tongue, still unsure which question was about to pour out. "Inspector Usher, I presume? My name is Ada. Jane and I joined very recently. I am not her. While I am awake, Jane sleeps. You understand this?" The hide that lived inside Jane's body moved differently. It held her body stiffer, moved more cautiously. Nick did understand, and he nodded. "You're not her," he grinned ruefully. "But it was her last night." "Oh, yes," Ada said and shook her head. "That was her." He started to speak again and stopped. He peered at Nick appraisingly, saw something that agreed with him, and nodded. "You should know she doesn't hate you. You don't put that much effort into someone you don't care for very deeply." Nick's eyebrows shot up, unsure how to respond, as Ada moved around Nick and approached a long table on the wall opposite the window. "Coffee?" Nick nodded, turning to watch Ada pour the steaming black gold from a silver thermos into an identical white mug. "Do you still take it black, no sugar, Inspector?" Nick laughed. "I see you and Jane have been talking." The hide shrugged Jane's shoulders. Another distinctively not Jane gesture. Nick walked closer to accept the cup of coffee. "We keep each other informed," Ada said and sipped from his own cup. "On to business. You have something for me, or want something of me. Which is it?" Nick smiled. He liked the way Ada talked. "You cut right to it, don't you?" Ada smiled. "I find brevity makes things easier all around." Nick thought for a second and tugged the necklace out from under his shirt. He tore it off with one hard tug and held it out to the hide fixer. Ada focused on the cylinder, his face unreadable. He took another sip from his steaming mug and then turned his body and gestured to the overstuffed sofa and chairs. "Let's sit and talk." Nick sat and started talking. He began with saving Counselor Underwood's life and his subsequent off-the-books investigation to uncover the true reasons for the assassination attempt. Ada listened absolutely silently as Nick described what he'd found. The Hyde rose and refilled their mugs as Nick fast-forwarded to Roland Byrd's escape, how his now-murdered boss, Captain Yates, had saddled him with Liaison Officer Tyson, and the subsequent attempt on their lives just hours before. "How is she?" Nick blurted out after spilling to Ada every detail that had led him and Tyson to the roadhouse. Ada's eyes crinkled in a way he'd never seen Jane do. It would have looked better on some kindly old man's face. "She cares about you, Nicodemus, so I'm going to share some things with you." Nick tensed as Ada stared into space, picking his words. Barrett's syndrome was a death sentence for her. She knew this, and Ada ran his fingers along the tattoos down the side of the neck he shared with Jane. It changed her. Her accident on duty, a direct result of hiding her tremors to keep her badge, could have cost lives. She knows this. Even so, she felt betrayed. You let them take her without a word. You didn't come to her trial. You never visited her in prison. Nick's body tensed. He nodded. "It's true," he whispered. He didn't defend himself by saying why he'd never visited. Didn't admit it hurt too much to lose Jane once, to go through it again, just as much as losing Pesh had hurt. Ada laughed. "Gods, you're uptight. Who told you you had to carry all of Locklaw on your shoulders? This isn't a Greek tragedy, Nicodemus. She's coming out the other side." Ada's eyes twinkled mischievously. "But as far as you two are considered, I think we're both very much still in the dark." Tired of vague messages, Nick held up the necklace and tiny tube again. "Fine, I'll download some psychotherapy from EerieNet after all this is over. Can we get to business?" "Try Martel. There are better AI practicing at more reasonable rates over there." Ada held up his hands in surrender, his face taking on a sheepish look. All right. Forgive an old man for pushing." Ada's eyes focused on the tube again. "Speaking of Erie or Martel, those are the usual networks people sell and barter over. So what is this you've brought me?" Ada reached out for the tube and Nick's hand moved, scooping it into a protective fist. He let his suspicion play on his face. "You seek assurances? Guarantees?" Ada sighed and nodded. "Jane and I joined. We are family. This will never change. Physiologically, we're still gluing ourselves together, but there's no going back. I'm all in with Jane. Otherwise, I'd be fitting myself for a straitjacket." Ada leaned forward, voice dropping to a whisper. "You are totally safe here, Inspector. Jane is part of me, and regardless of any anger she has to work out with you, she's vouched for you." Ada placed Jane's smaller hand atop of Nick's. "Besides," he asked in a pragmatic, chiding way, "where else do you think you can go?" Nick barked a laugh. Where else? He wondered to himself, but he knew the answer to that. He met Ada's gaze. They were kind eyes. Complicated, Nick saw, but kind. He knew it was time. Time to trust or run. He trusted. Nick's fist opened and lay flat. "Thank you, Nicodemus," Ada said. He took the vial, then shifted Jane's weight into Nick's personal space. "I promise you are safe from me, and I think I can guess at your motives for disappearing from her life when the city ground Jane in its gears. I may even sympathize." Nick held his breath, staring at the protective old man peering out of his ex-partner's face. "But don't you dare hurt her again." Nick glared back. "Hurt her again? How am I supposed to do that?" Ada shook his head. "Why do human males take the better part of a century to grow a brain?" Nick tried to hold the glare, but couldn't. "You know, my mother used to say something like that." Both men chuckled. Then Ada shook the vial. The liquid sloshed around inside, and the Hyde quirked an eyebrow. Nick nodded, answering the unasked question. Pond water. Ada understood instantly. How else could a cop keep an investigation into Bennett Underwood from discovery? Nick was surprised how quickly Ada reasoned that out, but he recovered quickly and nodded. The hide was right. DNA-encoded data, while inherently unreliable and holding no value as evidence in a court of law, was also outside of the establishment's chain of command, and the only place a city councilor couldn't reach. There was no better way to track someone whose fingers could extend anywhere in the legal world. That attempt on his life last year got me digging. I can't tie him to anything, but Underwood Industries has fewer union actions than any other transport fleet on the docks, fewer pirate attacks on its fleet outside Locklaw, and fewer criminal investigations than any corporation in the city. Ada said nothing, but motioned for Nick to continue. Underwood's access to police data means he'd have known exactly when and where Bird arrived. This whole Bird terrorism thing plays right into his hands with the Haven trade negotiations, and Underwood Industries makes no bones about wanting that contract. Ada stood and walked back to the coffee tray, dropping his empty mug. He knitted his fingers together, tapping his pointer fingers on his chin as he walked back across the room to stare out the window. Nick's vial swung beneath the hide's hands as he stared out that window. You think Locklaw City Councilor Bennett Underwood sprung a terrorist from jail as part of a coordinated conspiracy to sway public opinion in favor of the Haven trade negotiations, all to expand his personal power and his empire? And had a police captain and the Haven leadership killed to seal the deal, Nick said to Ada's back, making Haven into sympathetic victims in the bombing. Ada wondered aloud, and Jane's hair bobbed as he nodded her head and raised the vial to eye level. Unfortunately, that vial's useless without a Pondy to interpret. And I can't reach out to my contact with people trying to kill me. I'm quite aware, Inspector, Ada said, turning to face him. His face was alive, fierce, calculating. Luckily, my roadhouse attracts quite a diverse clientele. Oh, Spillane? Wait a minute, just one goddamn... Tyson jerked out of his light sleep at the sound of the struggle in the hall, but the aches and pains spread across his body broke his attention. He groaned and sat up, resting his elbows on his knees. He was naked, under a light blue sheet. He shook his head and looked around. The room was empty. He rubbed his shoulder, and it all came flooding back to him. Tyson remembered how he'd hurt his shoulder in the fight with the woman, Jane. He shifted his weight and felt another ache lower down, that one also in part caused by Jane, even though he'd been a willing and enthusiastic participant. Even alone in the room, Tyson blushed. He'd never fought a woman that could hold her own before. So strong, so fierce, then to have her collapse in his arms. He'd put her arms around her and she'd sunk into his embrace, but just for a moment. Then she'd punched him again, beat him a step back, and turned to storm across the room to face Usher. Usher had just let her come, let her swing for his head. That blow had never come. Usher struggled with words. He only got one out. Jane whirled away before the next words surfaced. Tell me in the morning, she choked out, then stormed back to Tyson and grabbed a fistful of his shirt, dragging him along with her out of the room. Jane had brought him to this guest room with the blue sheets on the bed. Tyson had been reticent at first, trying to pull her arms off of him when her obvious pain and need bubbled through her anger. It was unlike him, what had happened in this room last night. But the same ingredients were boiling in Tyson, too. He'd needed their time together as much as Jane. I done nothing wrong, the indignant and slightly drunk human voice howled again. I'm paid in full. Let me go, you scaly mother. The scuffle was farther down the hall now. This time, the human male's words were cut off by a low Skanen growl. Tyson rolled off the bed, hopped into his pants, and stepped into the hall, his shirt still in hand. The Skanen was pushing another man, naked from the waist up, of average height, but with a well-muscled chest and arms. One bicep had a System Guard medallion tattoo, with a red slash through it. The other was twisted behind his back. Tyson pulled the shirt over his head and followed the two silently down the hall. The Skanen, Tyson was pretty sure it was Spillane, Jane's bodyguard from the night before, pushed him through elegantly carved wooden double doors and pushed him to the floor. Here's your guy, Spillane growled, standing behind him and crossing both sets of upper limbs. Tyson saw Jane and Nick on the far side of the room, relaxed his wary stance, and stepped inside. "Look who's up," Nick glared at him. Tyson nodded back, keeping emotion off his face. The human on the ground had a thick red beard, knotted into long twin ponytails. "What the hell?" he shouted. "I still got time on the clock with Conchita. Get this insect off my back before I swat him." Jane stepped forward, wearing a silk robe with splashes of color that seemed to waver and migrate across the fabric. He remembered what lay under the robe, and his face reddened. Involuntarily, he looked at Nick, then looked back to the figure on his knees. "You are Jacoby, yes?" Jane asked. The big man turned his head away from the Skanen and stared at Jane's robed form. A drunken leer formed there. "Yeah, that's me. You pinch-hitting for Conchita?" Jane smiled and shook her head. "Spillane." She made a hurry-up motion with one hand. A spray hypo appeared in one of the Skanen's middle arms, coming up under Jacoby's massively muscled right arm to hiss against his neck. Jacoby jerked and sucked in a deep breath. His eyes cleared up, and the slur disappeared from his speech. "Hey, I pay good money to get that messed," he growled. "We'll run you a tab," Spillane said, and pushed the man forward. Jane tossed Jacoby a thin tool with a fine tip and flat handle with inset display. Jacoby stared at the small tool, almost dwarfed in his one hand, as he rubbed the top of his bald scalp with the other. "You want me to work? Now?" "If you can help us with something delicate, Mr. Jacoby," Jane murmured in her most encouraging voice, "I'll transfer 20,000 Lou hours to Airy or Martel, and put Conchita on private retainer for as long as you'd like to stay." Jane's brows furrowed, and she looked past the bald man to the Skanen, providing. "Oh, Conchita's up for it, Ada," Spillane replied before Jane finished her question. "Seems Loverboy here is a preferred client." Tyson's brow furrowed. Why was Jane going by the name Ada? Her mannerisms and speech patterns were different now, too. He watched her carefully. Was she playing a role? To what end? Jane smiled wider at Spillane's assurance. "In that case, I'll throw in unlimited whatever you're drinking, and your pick of theme rooms, after we conclude our business, Mr. Jacoby." Jacoby beamed like a man who'd won the lottery. "It's Scotty to my friends, and you got a deal." He flipped a safety cover off the back of the device and held it towards Jane. The hand dropped again quickly, and a concern flitted across his stone-sober face. "Only condition is, it's just, I ain't gonna get someone killed, am I?" "I'm not on the hunt, Scotty," Jane assured him. "There is great risk, but only for the people in this room." "Wait, as in me? I'm the someone that could get killed?" The smile died on Jacoby's face. Not for a year with Conchita if whatever's in this squirt is going to take me out." Usher stepped forward, wearing a version of Tyson's own angry cop face. "What's it going to take?" the inspector growled. Jacoby looked around. All the swagger left Jacoby as quickly as the alcohol had after his shot. "Okay, what are we talking about?" He tapped the small tool in his hands against his temple. "What are you going to do to me versus what's getting in bed with you going to do to me?" "We're going to do nothing to you," Jane promised, stepping forward. "You'll be looking for patterns, names, dates, and paper trails between powerful people." Jacoby blinked and swallowed. How powerful?" "Pussy," Spillane snorted. "A city councilor," Jane admitted, and Jacoby's eyebrows shot toward the ceiling. She talked over him before he could voice his obvious concern. "But do this, and you will have my protection. Do you understand?" Jacoby blinked again, the color coming back to his face, and his spine straightened out. Tyson guessed this was better than a good deal. "Keep talking, Mr. Ada." "Mister?" Tyson raised a finger, but before he could open his mouth, Usher coughed. Tyson looked his way, caught his head shake. Reluctantly, he dropped his finger and shelved his question. "Tell me more," Jacoby asked, "because this could be great for me. Or I might prefer you to take me out now." His fear obvious, Tyson also saw a confidence in his own abilities, despite the unfamiliar ground Jacoby found himself on. He guessed that whatever service he was negotiating, Scotty Jacoby was very good at it. "We're tracking a conspiracy behind the trade negotiations," Usher said. "I won't tell you who until you accept, but the mover is a counselor. I want you to find the trail and tell us who, where, and how, but there's a tie-in you need to know. The sentient we're looking for freed Roland Bird." Jacoby closed his eyes. His nostrils flared with quick, deep exhalations. The color drained from his face. "Shit on a cracker," he muttered and opened his eyes. "You folks don't mess around, do you?" Jane smiled, nodding her head in a gesture of respect to Jacoby's fortitude before continuing. "In addition to a connection to Roland Bird, this counselor is one of the Haven Talk's declared supporters." "More than that," Usher said. "They're using Bird to shift citywide sentiment for trade with Haven into the 4 column. They're playing a long game." Jacoby shook his head and tittered, but kept his cool. Tyson gave the man his due. He was adapting well to the news. "Okay," Jacoby said. "Makes sense. Kind of a weird coincidence, huh? Bird ending up here when the talks happened." He held a hand out, flexing his fingers in a gimme gesture. Usher held out the necklace and attached cylinder. Jacoby took it, deftly twisted the cylinder free, and slotted it in the small instrument he held. It looked like a hypodermic, but there was no spray nozzle or needle on the end. "You're a Pondy," Tyson said, disgust slipping out with his sudden understanding. Tyson understood the importance of information. The system guard networks were unwelcome in many places, tolerated only through the strongest firewalls in many more. Despite the guards' best outreach, even many of their trading partners and neutral independent worlds trusted their data only to the Aerie and Martel networks. Even on Academy Rock, you could pay for services in lieu. Many guard citizens and officers maintained a lieu account with one or both of the independent data networks. It saddened him that more people resisted joining their strength with the guards. Pirates, corrupt governments, and black markets were only possible on an interplanetary scale because of Aerie and Martel business practices. However, even he had to admit both of those independent data networks had worked hard to earn the trust of populations throughout Farlost. Sometimes those networks helped oppressed people get the word out. Sometimes those networks made science advancement, piecing together of Farlost's history, even medical breakthroughs possible. But all of it was done in the name of profiting Aerie and Martel, and all other considerations were secondary. Tyson grudgingly accepted that access to one of the 2 competing networks made many people's lives better, at least until the more advanced, more secure guard networks were more fully embraced. Pondies, though? Tyson shuddered. Who would risk implanting a synthetic organ in their brain? A synthetic organ to absorb, decode, recode, and excrete petabytes of information stored in a liquid solution of DNA. Unlike either Aerie or Martel, though, the information was not a bit-for-bit copy. The encoding process was haphazard. The organ that translated the data was only as good as the host's brain. It was inadmissible in court, technically unreliable. The only uses for pawned data were outside the law, criminal, smuggling, and unhealthily paranoid individuals. Anyone could drug themselves and capture their memories. Anybody could absorb a memory or an experience, albeit only temporarily, for the duration of the chemicals that bonded those foreign memories to the sentient's neural nets. Only a Pondy could edit, combine, recode, and encrypt those memories. Undetectable as anything other than ordinary tears, Pondies could access portions of junk DNA and read or store information there. Without the proper key phrase or associated image, even the Pondy who carried the encoded data wouldn't be able to know there was anything stored in the junk DNA. Smuggler's data, spy data, criminal data, all filtered through a sentient's own brain. What military court or citizen's tribunal would trust overloaded gray matter enough to sway a verdict? None, Tyson thought. Scotty Jacoby sneered at Tyson. Got a problem, little doggy? Where do I start? Tyson shot back. Behind Scotty, Spillane chuckled. I bet Mr. Chin here wouldn't take a piss in a toilet that didn't have a sun medallion seal around it first. Jacoby and Spillane both erupted into laughter. A moment later, each sentient's eyes narrowed at the other's, and the laughter cut off. Crab, Jacoby swore. Meat sack, Spillane swore back. Tyson ignored the Skanan's jibe and remained silent. He was here for Bert, he told himself. He was here for Salah. Usher stepped forward, surprising Tyson by not sharing Jacoby and Spillane's laugh. His face was open and trusting. There's no network, no information broker in the city. I have faith a sentient as powerful as a counselor couldn't access. Even Airy and Martel could be hacked or have information exchange protocols in place for the right person. Tyson smiled tightly. At least Usher was realistic about the limitations of the capitalists who peddled absolute truth and data protection. His smile turned into a frown. A flash of Salah, leaning drunkenly out over the top bunk and smiling down, filled Tyson's mind. A vivid moment from their last vacation together. Salah had gotten himself and Tyson out of a bar brawl on Spintop Station and somehow navigated their way back to the docks and on board the yacht they'd borrowed from Kesh shipyards. Tyson had been amazed Salah had talked their way out of the bar, a local haunt for Spintop crew called Grav C-17, without holes in their hides. There was no love lost there for System Guard in that bar, and an inebriated Tyson had opened his mouth a little too loud about growing up on Academy Rock. A few people had been hurt before Tyson and Salah made their escape. As the adrenaline faded and the alcohol burned itself off, leaving exhaustion and exhilaration in their place, Tyson had joked only their pure guard spirit had saved them. Beware anyone too sure their spirit and their right are absolute, Salah had said, leaning drunkenly out over the top bunk and smiling sadly down at his brother. One of the many things his brother said that haunted him now that he'd never be able to get answers. So how does this work? He asked. If his voice broke over the words, no one seemed to notice. They usually piss in a cup to prove they won't keep a copy of the data, Spillane growled. Sometimes they roofie themselves to guarantee they won't remember anything they do while on the job. We take short-term memory blockers, yes, Jacoby replied, his voice tight with annoyance. But bringing memory blockers on a visit to your favorite escort is usually frowned upon. I bet I can scramble his short-term memory, boss, the Skanen stage whispered as he leaned over Jacoby's shoulder. If I bonk him on that chrome dome really hard. That's enough, Spillane, Jane said in a clear, high voice. Fine, the Skanen said, his head bowed and his shoulders bunching up. He nodded and took a step away from Jacoby, looking to Tyson like a kicked puppy. Look, Jacoby said, looking around at everyone. I got no amnesia juice, but it sounds like you don't got no choice anyway, right? Everyone was silent. And I can be quiet. Got a good reputation for it, you know it, Ada. Tyson was starting to understand the name change and the different behavior Jane was showing. Even the cadence of her voice was different. I am not threatening your life, Mr. Jacoby. I wouldn't have a good reputation if I did that every time I was under the gun. How about instead I offer you a job? A job? The words leapt out of both Jacoby and Spillane's mouths. For the Roadhouse? Jacoby asked, stepping forward excitedly. There is often a need for a reliable Pondy at the Roadhouse. We have someone on retainer. I've been meaning to add another for some time. You do that? Usher asked. Jane nodded. Anything for you, Nicodemus, Ada said. You are family. I want to be family, Jacoby blurted and held out a hand. Ada considered the hand. Spillane crossed both upper arms. You trust us without a contract or anything? He said, in a voice very clearly meant for Ada, not the shirtless human. You're offering me a choice instead of killing me, Jacoby said. Staring fiercely at the robed woman Tyson was forming two very different impressions of. Plus, yeah, everyone trusts the Roadhouse. That's the deal, right? Can't be no Roadhouse without trust. Ada smiled a different smile. This one was proud and fierce. That's the deal, Mr. Jacoby. She reached out and her own small hand disappeared inside his large muscular one. Still clasping her hand, Jacoby put the implement to his eye. Call me Scotty. One finger stretched to push his upper eyelid up, and then the device hissed. Tyson watched a mist coat Jacoby's eye. Welcome to the family, Scotty, Ada murmured, letting her hand fall away. Jacoby rubbed his eye vigorously and began pacing back and forth. He murmured. and stopped rubbing at his eye, instead rubbing the back of his neck with his large muscular hand. He took a deep breath and twisted his massive upper body. Tyson heard vertebra pop. "How long will this?" Tyson began to ask when Jacoby stiffened and whipped around to stare wide-eyed at Usher. "Underwood? Are you kidding me? I thought maybe Cree or one of the—" His deep voice pitched higher as fresh information flooded his brain. "Holy shit! Yeah, that makes sense." He stopped speaking and began pacing again. "I see papers and data screens with his name on it. I see Underwood Industries employees placed at the Roadhouse, but Underwood's the one guy who never goes to the Roadhouse. He never plays with the dock rats." Emboldened by the information lighting his eyes from behind now, Jacoby stepped close to Usher. "Some of this comes from you. I mean, your thoughts are in here too. You dosed and saved some of this yourself." Tyson stared at Usher with a new respect. He'd planned this campaign against Underwood for a long time, with no personal stake in the matter, only his personal sense of right being wronged, and the barest of hunches. Despite his issues with the system the inspector worked so hard to protect, Tyson had come to respect the man's personal values and commitment to something larger than himself. He thought again how much his brother would have liked the inspector. "How come nobody investigated him before?" Jacoby demanded of Usher. "A hero of the Civil War?" Usher said, his voice deceptively light. "You kidding?" "All right," Jane said in a tone that drew Jacoby's gaze. "We know he's been involved. We know he's got ties to criminal enterprises, and we believe he's freed Roland Bird to reverse public sentiment into support for trade with Haven." Everyone watched her silently. She rolled her eyes. "Is there anything in there that can prove it?" Jacoby waved a hand at Jane, shushing her. Spillane bristled, but Jacoby was inside his head again, a million miles away, and didn't notice or care. "Let me work it." He cocked his head. Then his eyes focused back on Usher. "That ship you live on, it's ancient, ain't it?" Usher looked suddenly uncomfortable. Jacoby raised his hands. "No worries, pal. It's just every straight thought you had when you were dosed to save this information got scooped up with your surface thoughts," he said, and his voice was genuinely warm. His gaze drifted between Jane and the inspector. "We're family now, remember?" Jane's face reddened. Usher's eyes narrowed. "Just stick with Underwood," he warned the Pondy. Jacoby put his hands up in surrender, an expression of feigned innocence on his face. "Of course." The feigned innocence fell away into a leer. "Bet you never expected someone else would feel the itches you feel, huh?" Usher's face turned the same color as Jane's, and he took a step forward. Jacoby's face abruptly changed too, though, and Usher froze in place. "There's other data stored. Not from you. Other cops? No. Criminal informants?" Jacoby nodded. "Yeah, you got one or two of your low-life snitches suckling the police budget teat to follow Underwood's employees and aides, and, oh." Jacoby started pacing again. 3 different flunkies from Underwood HQ met here at the Roadhouse." Jacoby shivered. He glared at Usher. "Would it kill you to stake your spies a little cash for a warm meal? You think it's easy following somebody outside in the cold all hours of the night?" Usher held his tongue. Tyson could see it cost him a little bit of effort. For his part, Tyson just stared, wide-eyed. It was witchcraft, mesmerizing. Jacoby wasn't reading files. He was remembering events that people had tracked while dosed, then handed those memories in to Usher like homework. "And they don't remember anything that happened while they were forming these memories?" Jacoby asked. Usher shook his head. "I remember. I took encoding virals without an amnesia component. The CIs working for me don't remember. They got the amnesia juice." "That's good," Jacoby murmured, one finger and thumb rubbing the line of skin between his split and braided beard. "We got an uphill battle here. They'd be in for a pile of hurt if that walking Christmas decoration ever got hold of these memories." "Christmas decoration?" Usher said. Jacoby nodded. "Yeah, an exoed human. All silvers, a full job set of upgrades." He waved a hand at the back of his own bald head. "Implant, neck reinforcements, pimped out to the nines. No dock worker, this guy." He turned to face their host. 2 different CIs saw this guy." Jacoby pointed at empty air as if he saw him, too. 3 different nights, Seems Shiny showed up every time your CIs were watching 3 different Underwood flunkies, and Shiny and Flunky both left about the same time each time, too. Tyson was watching Jane when understanding flashed in her eyes. Murdo, she whispered. Usher stepped closer to Jane. Tyson felt himself closing in too. Spillane pushed past Jacoby, purely on bodyguard reflex, Tyson guessed. Who's Murdo? Tyson asked. Can he connect Underwood to Bird? Usher asked, his words as fierce as the pounding in Tyson's chest. We're close, Sala. I can feel it. Jane laughed, but not a happy sound. I had to be sure. I ought not to have doubted my instinct, but with stakes this big... The bitter noise of someone realizing exactly how they'd been played escaped her throat. Oh, Underwood, Jane breathed. You are a master. Where is Roland? Tyson almost shouted the words. Spillane sidestepped closer to him, flexing his claws, but Jane reached out and placed her fingers on Tyson's arm. She looked over to Usher and back to Tyson. Jane sighed. No, not Jane. Tyson finally realized, deep in his gut as well as in his brain. It was the touch that did it, not Jane. Ada. He's right where I put him. You have been listening to The Rundown, a Farlost story, written by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Opening music, Everything Is Not What It Appears, kindly provided by Nate Maingard at natemaingard.com. Closing music, Full On by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. If you like what you hear, you can become a patron and support more stories at patreon.com/servingworlds. Thanks for listening. See you next week.